And Annette, just
All
to
right.
let everyone know, I am going to record it so we can have it to send out later.
Yeah, perfect. So this is being recorded. So if anybody here wants to share it with other folks in their agency or anything, that will be possible. You can go ahead and advance it to the next slide, Peggy. So what exactly is community asset inventorying? For one, simply, it's a process for identifying community resources. It's to help us understand what's available as far as systematically in our region, in our service networks. But the whole idea of asset inventorying is that you're identifying strengths rather than needs. It's a way to do planning without getting weighed down in problem solving. And I think for anybody who's been involved in any kind of strategic planning operations, you know how easy that is to do, for it to start feeling overwhelming. And we kind of divert all of our attention to what we don't have rather than what we may have that could help us through this process. Okay, Peggy. So why would we do asset analysis rather than gap analysis? Looking at what we have to work with, and not like a gratitude journal. So I don't want folks to feel like this is kind of, this touchy-feely exercise where we're all sitting around feeling grateful for what we have instead of really getting some type of analysis of what we don't have and how we get there. But rather, it's a way that we don't go down this abyss of everything we've lost or everything we've never had. And I think that can really derail a lot of processes. Okay. So identifying problems tends to yield different approaches than when you identify strengths. One of the things that we know is that problems tend to expand and morph. Again, think back to any of the past processes, planning processes that you've been involved with, and you'll start with a problem, and that problem turns into 3 other problems, and that turns into 6 other problems, and it can get really unwieldy very quick. Problems tend to suck all the air out of the room. We often don't get to the solutions. It's hard to move forward because we keep thinking of one more problem, one more thing. Problems also tend to amplify our anxiety and our helplessness. At least that's how it tends to work for me and other groups that I've been in. You end up leaving those processes not feeling hopeful and invigorated, but rather like, oh crap, we really do have a huge issue here, and I don't know how I'm going to dig myself out of it. And it's also hard to keep people engaged long term when you're discussing problems instead of solutions. Folks will come to the first meeting, a few folks, a lot of them that have been voluntold that they have to be there will hang on a little bit longer, but it's very hard to get a long-term commitment for folks to come to meetings that are problem-driven. Problems, I think, also limit big thinking. If you keep bringing things back to the problem silo, you never tend to get outside of that. And I think the other problem when you're talking about big groups within a community, I think problems do encourage one-upmanship. There's a lot of, you think you have it bad, let me tell you, how bad we have it. And I think the kind of poor mouthing kind of thing abounds, well, you've had all this money for this long and you have this kind of budget and you have this, we only have this. And so I don't think that's the intent going into it, that folks want to go in and kind of one-up each other in the you think you have problems kind of situation. But I think doing a problem of focused analysis just kind of lends itself to that. Okay. So what I like about working with asset inventorying is it really sends a really strong message that we're in this together. That all potential partnerships are not obvious nor traditional. We don't, if you use the same players, a lot of times you'll have the same score, right? You've already kind of divvied up the pie, so to speak, within your community of who traditionally gets money to do what pieces of the work that kind of overlaps with both groups here. But I think a lot of communities will prefer a community-driven approach. I think a lot of communities kind of resent the experts that come in and tell you how to fix things. You know that you know your community better than other folks know your community. And what's going to work in San Antonio, for instance, is going to be very different than San Angelo, which is certainly going to be, different than what's working in Plano or what works in Pleasanton. So you have very different communities, you have different resources, and it's not all going to work the same. Even if you all have the same problem, you do not have the same resources and solutions to those problems. So again, working toward the solution-driven, what I have is going to work a lot better than the problem. If you want people to care about your mission, you have to care about theirs. And I think this is tough because the many, many years that I've been doing this work, a lot of times we're sitting together within our organizations trying to figure out how we get other people in the community to care about the work we do and the people that we serve. And I think we spend a lot less time in the room figuring out what we can do to help somebody else with their mission and how we care about what they're doing and what they're contributing. I think early on in my career, just by way of an example, I can remember trying to get into a particular elementary school because we would notice that we had a lot of folks that were reaching out to our organization that had kids in the school. There were different issues that were going on. And so we really worked probably a lot harder, put a lot more time into it than we should, trying to get into this particular elementary school in our service area. And, one of the things that, we would try to do is, besides showing up all the time and trying to be helpful, and they would have, these different fairs that they have for kids, where you have people that come and set up the tables and different information and that kind of stuff would be out there. And we would do this over and over again, and we were not making any headway getting into that school. And one of the things that I know just irked me is that every time I went by that school, the fire department was there. We would see the fire truck out there. The firemen would be all dressed up in their gear. The kids would be crawling all over the truck. And I used to think to myself, how does the fire department get in and we can't get in? I just didn't understand what the relationship was, how that worked. And so at one point I decided, every time there is a community fair, every time there's a school carnival, every time there is anything, I'm going to ask to be physically placed at the table next to the fire department. And so over the next, during the course of this school year, I would get to know the folks that were working the booth for the fire department. And, would talk to them, chit chat, joke, whatever, but developed a relationship with these folks. And at some point, the people at the fire department said, how come you're not? Why don't I see you in the schools? And I'm like, well, this is a very good question. And found out that, I think the fire chief's wife was actually an assistant principal. Found out that there was a really tangible reason why the fire department was there, and it had to do with long-term relationships. Well, at this point, I think the fire department developed a relationship with us, knew that we weren't, some crazy folks who were going to come in and scare the kids, We didn't have an agenda that was counter to what the school's agenda was, all those kinds of things. And so they were able to provide a referral for us that would have never happened if we didn't spend so much time at school carnivals, courting the fire department. Now, the fire department obviously is not a traditional, partner that we have with Rape Crisis Center or Battered Women's Shelter and those kinds of things. But this goes to show that we really need to start looking at who has the access that we want, who has the resources that we also need, who can help provide services to the folks that we provide services to. And this will be especially important if we lose certain programs. So if we lose, people in our counseling department, which piece did we lose? Did we lose the counseling that works with folks that are not English speaking? So who else can do that work? Is this, a program we had with transients or homeless population? Is this for legal services? Is this, what is the place that in our community where these other resources can be found? So the process of building trusting, functioning relationships is something that I think we frequently try to rush or short circuit ourselves because it seems like a luxury that we don't have. We don't have time for doing all that. It seems like soft work. It doesn't feel like we're making, we don't know how to quantify it. We don't know how to report it. It just seems like frivolous work. But I think when you're in a process, a planning process, where you're trying to look at your strengths in your community, the only way to find those strengths is also to be working with people and building those relationships. So when you are working a project, they see you as a smart, reasonable, reliable partner. So we need to work at not always trying to fast forward on the relationship building and not feeling like that is somehow frivolous or a waste of time. Okay, Peggy, can you advance that? So why does asset analysis work? I think some of the reasons is that positivity feels better than negativity. And I think, go back, for those of you who are go to church, think, which sermons energize the parishioners? Is it the ones that are, more positive, talking about love, or is it the ones that are a lot more, kind of hellfire and damnation? So, I think that the fact that positivity makes you feel better when you walk out of a meeting or a gathering than negativity shows you why this kind of analysis works. These are sessions that you leave feeling like this is something we can get through. This is something we can do together. I think the results work for all participants and not just those that are facilitating the work. If we stop telling people why they need to care about our work and started showing that we also care about their work, this tangibly helps all of us. I think we all feel more supported. We all feel less alone. I think it energizes us. It educates us. We know what others are doing. We know what their issues are. We feel better about forwarding folks that we work with, referring them out to other people when we're confident about their abilities and the scope of their work. Your efforts aren't your efforts aren't restricted by the size of your problem. Your motive might be more money, and I'm sure that a lot of folks initially start these asset analysis programs, projects, and planning because of money issues. But your outcomes are unlimited. There's so many things you might get from this that have nothing to do with money. Your final work product is a great starting point for a lot of future efforts. So, what I'm counting on is that, in 2 or 3 years, the funding landscape will change once again. We won't always be in this kind of sparse, everybody's fighting for the same dollars kind of situation. Funding tends to ebb and flow. So when the landscape's changed and you need an overhaul, you're not starting over at ground zero. A lot of this work that you may be doing now at just to kind of stay status quo and not close your doors can be very helpful for later when you're in a much better place and you're talking about a capital campaign, or you're talking about expanding into other counties, or whatever process that your work is taking on. This will help you. This will help you because you won't be starting at the same point. Okay. So as far as getting started, a lot of folks are probably thinking, this is all well and good, but how do we do this? How do we even get started? Set a very big table. I think that's the first thing. I think a lot of times folks' initial step will be to, pick a handful of folks that they feel like they can work with, and see, what we can do, who's at hand that we can get something from that'll help with what survivors need. We don't necessarily know what all those needs are going in, which is another reason for us to be looking at what community assets are available to us. If we only tried to learn more about things we already knew instead of being open to things that we don't know, I think would be very different. Who needs to be at the table? Whoever decides that they're going to go through this process, you want to pull some other people in that are not just with your organization, like a small planning group, and decide who needs to be at the table. Who are some of the public folks that should be there? What private folks need to be there? What nonprofits? What gatekeepers? What community legends? There's some folks that you need involved, because nothing that's not significant in that community ever happens without these particular individuals' blessings. Those are the folks that you want to get involved. And then how to get folks at the table, how to kind of do persuasive marketing so they know what's in it for them. The last thing a lot of people are looking for is another commitment to some ongoing meetings. So we want to make sure when we're trying to market this idea for them that it's very clear that it's we, not I. We're in the same boat, that this is easier together, that this is more effective, so that we're not each going through, like these individual planning processes, but this will ultimately save us some time and be so much more effective than if we were, doing this process with just our folks, so that people see what's in it for them to get involved. Okay. So, some of the other considerations that you might want to take to get maximum involvement is remember that the narrower the scope benefits your agency, but a broader scope gets more participation and more buy-in, but less focus. So, and you're probably trying to find that happy medium, right? So one of the things to do that's worked for a lot of folks is to find that middle ground. What's most doable, instead of saying we wanted to find what assets are available for, victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. If you instead, or say, we want to do some asset inventory for safe, healthy, responsive communities. Do you see how the partnerships are going to grow, and your focus falls neatly in there? It's certainly relevant to the work that you're doing, but at the same time, you can see how folks who are doing community health work, or you can see how folks that are, working with first responders, or all kinds of folks that are trying to do, nutrition or things within the schools. There's lots of things that can fall into that, but you also fall into it neatly. So it's a way to keep the scope narrow enough that your agency and the work that you do falls in there, but not, again, so broad that it just keeps kind of ballooning outwards and never kind of gets to where you need it to be. There's multiple avenues for involvement. You're not, especially if you have a large service area, so I don't mean just geographically large, but also we see this in really big cities. Getting from one area of the city to another area of the city a lot of times takes more time than getting 40 miles does out on a road that you go 70 miles an hour. So if you have a large service area like this, know that people are not going to be able to conveniently make it to all your in-person meetings. And in-person meetings, I would argue, are very important, but how else can people be engaged? Can they provide some of the feedback that you're looking for through other processes, through Zoom, through emails, through surveys, time at their establishment, so that the meetings aren't always in the same place? I think that also probably models the fact that we're all in this together, as opposed to saying that, but it's always conveniently located at your agency. So, kind of looking at those pieces as well. Have some kind of timeline involved for project completion, so they know that it's not a long-term obligation. For example, a lot of people will commit to something if they know that you anticipate this project is going to take, roughly 6 months, but it's not something that's in perpetuity. And I have seen meetings that are so open-ended that when you don't have a timeline involved, they can actually go on for years. So you want to make sure that there is kind of an end game, because it does help determine who will get involved with this process. It's very important that we have shared leadership. We are trying to model that process. We want that process to make sure it's inclusive of various missions, that it's inclusive of perspectives that may be different than yours, that frankly, it's even inclusive of different personality types. We don't all have those same strengths. And again, we're looking for strengths within our communities. And that's, not just people that look different than us and think the same. And frankly, it's understandable that we try to get folks who think the same, because there tends to be less friction that way. But there's a crude expression that it's better to have people inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. And there really is something to be said for that, to bring in folks, not that are so, abrasive and contrary that they derail your process, but certainly folks that maybe don't look at every situation the same way you do. It is a little easier when you're dealing with a strengths model like asset inventorying than a gap analysis, to keep folks more positive, though. I think that's one of the advantages to doing this. You want to be real clear and concise about how this benefits the whole community and not just a small segment of the population. So again, some of that has to do with marketing. Some of that has to do with how you wrap up each meeting, even how you present the meeting notes or the minutes and those kinds of things to make sure they're not skewed in one direction where people feel a little less valued or listened to. And understanding that communication is essential for engagement at every step. So not just communication, but transparency, ethical communication, making sure that, we don't have, little different side groups that are having extra meetings that aren't including other people, that, this process is a genuine process. Okay. I should also mention, if anybody has any questions along the line, please stick them in the chat room and we will try to address them as we go, because I don't want to get through this entire presentation and have folks feel like what they were looking for was not addressed. So when you have your initial meeting, which tends to be the one that folks worry about the most and prepare the most for, because I think after you get going, this is not a process that's super complicated. People will take on certain roles and it becomes a little easier, but that amount of planning that you put into the first meeting is very important. So, you obviously want to find out who's in the room and why they're in the room. What do they hope to accomplish in this process, and how do they want to contribute to the process? So this isn't a time just to say, well, my agency, provides, a food bank or those kinds of things. They'll talk about what they accomplish or what they can do at some point, but what do they hope to contribute to this process? What are some of their strengths and things that they think they can do to make this kind of community-wide process run better? But this is the only place where they might include some kind of problem statement that might be appropriate, because you don't want that to come up later. You want them to have that opportunity to put that in from the very beginning. Explain what a strength-based versus gap-based processing is. So again, this is very different than most of the planning we do. Most of the planning we do, again, is we identify problems and then we try to come up with solutions. If you don't take this critical step at the beginning with this group, they will inevitably return to identifying problems and more problems. So if you can get them on very early to understand what the difference is and get kind of a community agreement that we're going to hold each other in check, and that when people inevitably try to throw in, different problems and different barriers, that you say, we're going to do this a little differently. And I know that this is a learning process, and go back to strength-based versus gap-based processing. Your first meeting, it'll probably be a longer meeting than some of the others. So, brainstorming will be a lot of it. You'll probably want to set up some common asset categories within your parameters of your planning. So again, for just the example here, if you are going with like a safe, healthy, responsive communities, then you'll know that people like first responders and service organizations and nonprofits and churches and schools and hospitals and, volunteer organizations and certain businesses, those may be folks that everybody agrees should be there. Now, some of this planning will be done ahead of time, because obviously you want to have a lot of these folks at this first meeting. But one of the things you will also do at every meeting is to say, is there someone missing? Is there someone else that needs to be here? And make sure that the table's always big enough, and that everybody who should be at this table has been invited to this table. And then, you will also, I would let me backtrack a little bit. I also think it's important when you are brainstorming and you're filling out these different categories, don't spend too much time trying to figure out where things would go on the board. You know, a lot of things can work in different areas. You know, perfection is frustrating, it's time consuming, and ultimately it's unattainable. So, you know, sometimes good enough is good enough. And I think that's really hard for a lot of our personality types to get involved in this work. And so, you know, moving forward and getting something is what's important here as well. So you're going to be collecting information, you're going to be engaging the group, and you want to coalesce around whatever mission you all collectively decide on. So a lot of this is going to be recording data, getting constant input, devising methods to report back, discussing future in-person meetings and other options for engagement. And then also, we always want to respect participants' time. If we tell them that the first meeting, which tends to be a little bit longer than the other meetings, is 2 hours, then don't go 3.5 hours. Because even if you feel like you have momentum right now and that this is worth it, I think that sends us a message that the next meeting says it's an hour and a half, but it's actually going to be 3 hours. People will start deciding whether they can participate and whether they have time to participate based on history. So we want to make sure that we do respect participants' time. For that reason, it's really important that you have, you know, a facilitator, you have a timekeeper, you have other folks that are involved. Let me look at the chat right now and see.
Yeah, there's a question.
So yeah, I see Leticia. Regarding shared leaders, can you give examples of how non-professional community residents have become leaders in efforts around violence prevention? Yeah, so, okay. I think a lot of, let me give you an example. Sometimes you have service organization like like Junior Women's Club or folks like that, who you have somebody in the community who works on a lot of these, you know, projects and fundraisers and different things, and you see them in your local paper and you know who they are, and they may not have a specific role in any of these organizations that you're working with, but you also know they're the mover and shaker in this community, and folks always try to get them on their board, or folks try to get them on their fundraising committees, or, you know, that's who they use to try to attract other people to different work that they're doing and that kind of thing. Those are folks that may not be professionals in that they're not a therapist, they're not an advocate, they're not a CEO of a nonprofit, but you know that very little gets done in your community without their blessing, or at least doesn't get done well without their blessing. These are folks you're going to want to try to get involved. And these are folks that their name alone will bring in other members. Other people want to belong to this group or be part of this group because of their ability to pull in folks. So keep in mind that having that person to be a co-chair or to help facilitate these meetings can be incredibly helpful. Did I answer your question? Okay. If I didn't, feel free to speak up and I'll try to give you a better example of what we're talking about. All right, Becky, you want to advance that? Thank you. So one of the things we want to do after our first meeting is obviously to reflect on the processes. Like I mentioned, after the meeting, you're like, in retrospect, who's missing from the table? That it's very essential that we hear from. Sometimes what's missing determines who's missing. And I know that sounds like double speak, and perhaps it is. But what I'm talking about there is when you're going through this process and you're looking at all these things that your community has, you may still see some gaps. So you don't want to shift over to problems. You want to slip over to solutions. And you may say, oh, we still haven't heard about this, this, and this. So that means somebody's missing from the table. So rather than have a lot of people sit around and talk about a problem and how we're going to fix it, it's a way of looking at it. It's a way of looking and saying, that means there's somebody missing from this table who could provide that. That's an asset. So what asset do we need to have here? I think this is a good time after your first meeting to also decide, are you building your knowledge with this process? Are a directory of resources? Or are you just getting the usual suspects, right? So I think a lot of times we kind of go on autopilot. We start pulling it together. We kind of know who's out there, or we think we know who's out there. And we start getting folks that we're already working with, and you're like, okay, this is like assembling in a directory. I think we have to think broader than that. I think we need to think in terms of not who we need to continue to do our work, but who the people we work with and the people we serve, who they might need. And so we might not work frequently with, employment agencies, or we might not work with a tremendous amount of people who are, doing higher education, or, there's a million examples of, whether it's economic security, whether it's employment, whether it's education. There's so many needs that the people we work with need, even if they don't come to us for those needs. Being able to look at that process is a way to get somebody besides the usual folks that are a little bit more crisis driven, a little bit more, this is what we think you need as opposed to what you think you need. Was the process, one of the things you would look at in this self-reflection was this process too tight to encourage creative or more inclusive additions? Again, a lot of times the people that we've initially invited to this, we've been doing the work a million years. We think we already, know all the answers. And so we don't necessarily, and I kind of hate the term think outside the box, but whatever term is better than that, to look at that more broadly and think that there's other folks who could be contributing something to the folks that we work with, and not just the same old folks. If it's apparent that a few stakeholders or community members are dominating or not involved in the discussion, how can it be structured for a more fruitful participation? What we don't want is having, a couple of individuals who go in and try to railroad the process, who try to either, drive it over to what their needs are, or sometimes, just as importantly, almost use this meeting as a type of LinkedIn, where all they're doing is bragging and talking about all the wonderful work that they do, and not really giving anybody any participation, a chance to participate. And, that can be important. And then you frequently will have the folks that just come in that are just negative by nature. And so they just can't help themselves, or it seems like that. So how do we bring them back in? And that's why your leadership is so important, again, because there are some folks that are great at redirecting folks and keeping things positive and moving along. And then there's, other folks who, might be a little less patient and, abrasive and challenging when somebody keeps derailing them. So, what is the best way of getting that involved? see, it looks like we have another question. So Andrea says she thinks the questions would be excellent to send out to meeting participants in an anonymous survey with the results shared transparently with those same participants. Yeah, I think you're right. I think especially before people have kind of developed that kind of trust in relationship, I think folks are a little bit more hesitant to show their hand. Again, I think a lot of that is more likely when you're talking about problems, because folks don't want to talk about problems, which is, except we do. We say we don't want to talk about problems, but we do. But with this, we're talking about strength. There's actually a different kind of hesitation to sharing in these groups. Is people tend to be very protective of their sources. You know, so if this is a person who's given them a large grant before, or is one of their big donors, they're not likely to want to have to share the information about that. So we're not actually saying, who are your donors and how can we get some of that money? But that's how people might initially look at this. So, you know, it's going to be a little tricky about how that looks. Okay, let's see.
Annette,
Mike's not
Letitia,
working.
oh yeah, Letitia had a follow-up question. I just dropped it in your chat.
Okay. Working with an underprivileged community, we have great leaders from the community, but actual residents, not in the end goal, if you will. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, you're right. The example I did give does have to, is definitely more indicative of somebody who comes from a position of privilege. I think we can also, do you remember earlier when I talked about gatekeepers? Pretty much every community has certain gatekeepers. They have folks that are recognized as being a leader in that community. And those are folks you want to pull in as well. I think that is one of the things that you want to do before you have your first meeting, but also you want to do that later too, so that it doesn't end up, frankly, looking like a lot of rape crisis centers, which, you know, are, you know, usually overwhelmingly white and women and middle class. And if you don't want people to think that's what your group is, then that's not what your group should be looking like. So we do want to make sure that when we're pulling people together, we are looking at assets as being a lot more than just what kind of money somebody is bringing to the table and what kind of overt power they may have in this community, as opposed to more the soft power, the education, the skill set, the other kinds of things to be able to reach all of the people in our community. Right, Peggy. Move it to the next slide. So there's a lot of methods that we can use when we're doing asset inventorying. So what you would do is I would choose one or more that work for your needs. Some people will use asset mapping. Asset mapping can be kind of fun. I find it a little less useful as an end product and more useful, you know, as part of a planning process. But I have seen some communities that will use asset mapping and manage to use that as a product. You can do a comprehensive kind of general list of what all's available. You can do asset directories. You can do business directories. You can do project-specific partnerships and resources. And I think another thing you can do with this asset inventory process is come up with smaller work groups, because you may find, oh, we've got a lots of pieces here, and one big, huge map or one big, huge directory might be a little bit cumbersome and not exactly what folks are looking for, especially if they are involved on something that's very project specific. But you can divide people into smaller work groups and come up with different kinds of resources, maps, or directories that are helpful for more specific things. So you may say, well, we want one that's just working with, that's just for crime victims, or, you know, we want one that's just working on food insecurity, or, you know, any number of products that come up. At the same time, we know that when we're working with folks, you know, they may come to your organization because they're a sexual assault victim, and then they may very well have a ton of other issues that end up coming out that you want to make sure that they get plugged in and you know what's available for them in the community. Okay. Peggy, there you go. So if you're doing asset mapping, some of the examples that I've seen is that folks will look at what institutions or agencies are available in their service areas. So it might be churches, school, and I'm using these as examples, not because this is an exhaustive list. I'm hoping that you don't look at any of these materials and think that this is somehow the exact template that you need to use, and that this is covering all the different folks. I'm doing this more so you have examples of what we're talking about here. Certainly let it be just as broad as it is in your community. You'll have organizations, associations, groups. So is it charitable groups, civics groups, environmental, the different nonprofits, your religious groups, your social causes, special needs, your women's organizations, your men's organizations, your youth organizations, your veterans organizations. I mean, there are so many groups in a community. And again, you may not initially see the connection with the work you do, but it's so important that you see what is even out there to know who to reach out to. Let me give you another example. So at one time, I was the director of a brand new rape crisis center in a more rural area in Southern California. So we were starting from ground zero. I mean, we got some funding. We barely had, you know, any furniture. Yeah, I mean, we just needed, the needs were so great. And we were starting from the bottom here. And when we started looking at different folks who might be able to provide some assistance to us, I started looking and I was like, I'm competing against all these same groups, you know, trying to get some assistance here. Well, we had some defense contractors in our area. I can't see any, you know, positive correlation between defense contractors and sexual assault victims. But part of me was like, you know, if I made bombs for a living, I might want to get some good karma here. You know, I mean, it's like, what can I do? And the first thing I did is I reached out and I said, you know, essentially, you know, we're a brand new nonprofit. We're starting this, and we're starting from ground zero. You know, if you have, you know, furniture, office furniture, those kinds of things that that you are trying to get rid of, we would really like to talk to you about that. So I didn't even ask for money. The interesting thing is that it actually started a relationship that went over a period of time. I mean, they ended up being, you know, doing employee matching gifts, and they made donations to a youth program. They gave us the furniture we asked for, which was, you know, beautiful. But the point is, if we can go through a process where we actually know what is in our community and where we potentially could get some assistance, we ended up having, you know, people that we worked with that got interviews and got jobs, decent paying jobs with these groups, all based on relationships that we made. Asset mapping, which wasn't a thing back then, but I think, you know, many of us do certain pieces of this intuitively. And I think that this is just a way to make that a more comprehensive process that we can utilize in a lot of the work that we're doing. So it wasn't just donations, but it was also employment. It was also, they helped market a lot of the stuff that we did. A very unlikely partnership, but it was something that worked. So economics, so here is, you know, obviously your businesses, and gives different examples of businesses that you're likely to work with. And it says economics, we put funders in there because funders aren't donors, but they certainly are changing the economic picture for your organization there. Facilities and services, so telecommunication, real estate, you know, utilities, bail bondsmen. I can remember the Rape Crisis Center, Battered Women's Shelter in Bastrop. I remember years ago, they always kept a bail bondsman on their board. And the reason that they did that is they always knew when these batterers were going to bond out, based on somebody that they had on their board. So, I mean, it was something I would never have thought to suggest to anyone, but it worked for them because they knew their community and they knew that was going to be an asset for them. Cultural, this is something a lot of times we don't think in terms of galleries and our tourist attractions and our museums and historical buildings and parks and all that kind of thing, live music venues. Again, those can be definite assets, especially for the economic side, but also to have a place to hold different events. They can really help you in your marketing of your services and things, because lots of people go to those things. And the fact that they can give you, you know, they can comp you different types of ads and things like that in a lot of these playbills and different things that they're putting out can be incredibly helpful to you as well. Your community events, a lot of times we're looking for a signature event or something that people can identify with your organization year after year. Rather than starting a whole new thing, a lot of times there's ways to partner with events that are already happening in your community. So like, if you can do that, then you're not kind of reinventing and going through all these processes independently that, you know, frankly, take years to get the momentum. Find things that are already there and find out how you can fit in with it. And then obviously diversity and affinity groups is another way to meet the needs of the survivors that you're working with. Peggy? Individuals, again, so leaders, and that's not just leaders in the very formal, this person's the mayor, this person's, you know, the owner of this business, that kind of thing. There are a lot of folks that may be leaders in a community on a very different level. It could be, you know, it's the pastor or priest of a specific congregation. It could be, you know, somebody who is not theoretic, that's the wrong word, but informally, they're a big leader in a particular like immigrant community. We see this a lot, you know, like where you have Vietnamese fishermen that have moved in south of Houston. And it's like, if you're going to try to reach that group, there are certain elders in that community you want to make sure are involved and you have their blessing in the work that you're doing. There's lots of folks like that. Also relationships. You know, we have relationships already with folks. They may be personal relationships or professional relationships with folks that are in complete different areas from what we're working on. There's nothing wrong with using those relationships for the better communal good here. And certain experts, there are folks that come with skill sets, sometimes that aren't obvious skill sets. You know, it could be that they're, you know, they may be a small business owner. You know, they may own a nail shop or a bakery or, you know, some other small business in your community, but that you may find out that they're also, you know, could be, that they're fabulous artists, or, you know, you may find out that, you know, there is someone who, you know, works at the DMV, but they also, you know, speak several languages. I mean, there's so many skill sets that people may have that can actually be something that's helpful for this entire community process. And then physical assets, I think, is also important. When I first started looking at this, know that a lot of the asset mapping work actually has come out of New Zealand, which is actually not super surprising when you think about it. A lot of the communities are super isolated, and so they need to be self-sufficient, and they're looking for these different you know, folks and systems to help continue doing this work. And so they've looked at the physical assets too, because your physical assets in your community may be bringing in tourists and other potential support. They're certainly bringing in certain other problems, right? You know, somebody gets sexually assaulted at one of these campsites or in your greenbelt or at, you know, one of these other tourist attractions or those kinds of things in your area. You're serving these folks. You're not saying, oh, well, you're not a resident of this community, so I don't work with you. So, you know, there are ways that you can also benefit from these places. You just have to be creative about it. So, you know, there's other things that could be added to this. You could be talking about what are some of the positive attributes of your community? Are there certain things that set your community apart from other communities? I think a lot of us have this kind of hometown pride, and we think there's things that are very special about our communities. If we think we're special, then I think let's quantify what it is that makes us special. So is it our shared values? Is it we have a great history of cooperation in this community? Is it that we're super self-sufficient? Is it generosity? You know, this is a very generous community. It's small, but, you know, we take care of each other, and, you know, we put the money in our hometown. Can it be, you know, I think we're the most decent, you know, community members of any place I've ever lived. You know, it could be that we have high educational attainment. It could be that we have low crime. It could be that we don't have homelessness, and not just because we run them out of town, but because we've set things in place to make sure that their needs are taken care of, so we don't have people living on the street. I don't know what your particular community has or doesn't have, but that's one of the things that asset mapping does. And so if those are qualities that your community or positive attributes that your community has, you certainly could include those on this asset mapping as well. I know that this is a huge topic, and this is a relatively short period of time that we're going through it, but I did want to make sure that you at least understand what the process is, that this is something that is available. There's lots of examples you know, that you can Google templates on asset mapping, or, you know, we all know what a directory looks like, but on what this exactly looks like, you won't have to start over from fresh. But I did want you to at least be aware that this, if you haven't gone through community asset inventorying before, what it is, why it's helpful, why I think it works better than a gap analysis, and see if this is something that would be helpful for your community. And who, you know, just thinking about it, I hope your wheels are turning, like who you might be able to involve in your community that would be a great partner to help facilitate this, or who would be a good person to help keep everything on track at the meetings, and who you would want to include. So, you know, we have to do that pre-planning and get a group of folks together to decide who should be at the table, to think about different ways they can participate. I like that somebody talked about sending a survey out ahead of time. You want as many people involved in the process, knowing that there's not a table big enough where every person in the community that probably should be there is going to physically sit at that table, but also how to get as many of the folks there as possible, how to get as much feedback as possible, and understand that the product that comes out of this is valuable, but also the process itself is valuable, because we don't give ourselves enough time to do this relationship building. This is something that we short circuit frequently because it seems like I don't know how to count this on a timesheet. I don't know how to show that this is valuable. I don't know, it seems like visiting. It seems like, you know, how is this helping victims for me to be having these meetings with folks? So again, it's just, I'm hoping that this helps people to look at this process in a different way and to understand the value of this, and that this is not a waste of time. This actually can give really big dividends and help agencies get through some rough times. And frankly, I think there's some rough times ahead as far as funding. But most important thing is not that your agency doesn't, you know, lose any staff. And that sounds callous. Of course, that's important, and that should be something that people work for. But I do think keeping those services alive is what's paramount, is that people continue to get the work, the services that they need. Okay, let's see. The TCSA helps when grantors are on board. Okay, well, that sounds good. I'm appreciative. Let me see if I've missed any other questions. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Any, you know, you see my email there. Feel free to email me at the address I had, or at staff@taasa.org, because I do see those emails as well. If you will send those to me, if you have any questions, if there's any resources, if you think about anything after the call that, you know, what I can help with, please send those questions. I'd be happy to get back to you as soon as possible. But I'm hoping that this was valuable, and that folks can see how this might be something that can work in their community. Thank you so much, everyone. Peggy, did you have anything?
No, and there hasn't been anything else in the chat, but, you know, folks, feel free to put questions in the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask away if you have any. We'll be online for a few more minutes. I am going to stop the recording just to let y'all know.
Okay.